So welcome to, well, it's a new Speedway podcast. It's called the Talking Wheels podcast, and it comes out every week. It will be coming out from mid-March, start of the new season. So you'll be able to catch up with this on a Saturday when it comes out. And I've deliberately picked my guests for the first ever episode, and there's some reasons for this. It's very deliberate. My name's Michael Wright, or Writer74. You'll find me on Twitter. And I've got with me today, I've got Roddy McDougall, who I'm going to allow him just to introduce himself in a sec. But Roddy's behind a book that I've just finished reading, and it's fascinating. And the reason I really wanted this from the first episode is because actually what it does is it paves the way to really have a look and a check-in and a line in the sand, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of the way the world of Speedway, and particularly British Speedway, is at this moment in time. And then all the guests from then on, I think, kind of feed off that, really, and we can kind of take the progress from a lot of the things that Roddy brings up. So one thing I'm doing different, and, you know, there's a lot of fantastic Speedway podcasts out there, but one thing I'm trying to do is trying to bring in some guests as well in terms of some fan interaction. So I've also got with me, and I'll let Lynne come in a minute, but I've also got Lynne Murray with me, who is from Glasgow, is a fan of Glasgow Speedway, just gone back up to Scotland, and very knowledgeable, as we found out in the virtual green room. And I really want this to be something that you enjoy and you want to come on and get involved in the future. Send any questions and comments. So without further ado, that's a long intro, but this is the first episode. So Roddy, I just wanted to maybe just let you talk about this book. I've got it in front of me for anyone who sees this on YouTube. The No Brakes book, A Lost Season in British Speedway. So you have prowess in the writing world anyway, and some people may know about you, but would you just say a little bit about your background and the background to coming up with this book?
Certainly, Mike, and thanks very much for inviting me on. I feel very honoured to be on the first one along with Lynne, although I should say at the start, my affiliations are Edinburgh Monarchs, so I do hope that Lynne and I aren't going to end up arguing. I'm sure we won't. As you said, my background is actually as a journalist. And so I suppose I was approaching the book from sort of the point of view of being a journalist, but also being a Speedway fan. I mean, I got into Speedway quite a few years ago now when Edinburgh Monarchs raced at Powder Hall. I've always enjoyed it. I think that on its day, it is the most exciting sport there is. If you get a really well prepared track, 4 riders who are going for it, that minute's worth of action, I don't think you can beat it. Doesn't happen all the time, but I think it's really good. And my idea was to write a book starting in basically September 2019, which I know is going back a wee bit, and going through the 2020 season. Not so much recording the results, but sort of through the eyes of a few of the riders, promoters, fans, maybe a couple of the sponsors, just to sort of, in a sense, pick out some of the stories, the good human stories that keep British Speedway alive in 2020. Now, obviously, as we know, sadly, 2020 was a really tough year and there wasn't really a season. I think there was probably 14 or 15 meetings in the end. But what I did was I sort of still kept in touch with the riders, the promoters. I've got to say hats off to all of them. They were all very keen to take calls, even although, you know, spring last year, spring 2020 was not a great time. And what I've also did was sort of try and reflect some of the storylines, you know, TV coverage, general mainstream coverage, the fact that I think, you know, comparisons with Polish Speedway in the book as well. So I think, whether it kind of succeeds on all levels or not, I'll leave that to other people. So I've had some very nice reviews, which have been heartwarming. So it's sort of looking at it month by month, but also reflecting what was going on in the wider world and also the history of Speedway.
Yeah, thank you, Roddy. That's a really good intro. And I think what struck me was that, you know, it looked from the outside like it was a deliberate account of a lost season, really, as if that was the main thing to read up on. And I did wonder how much material will you get from that, really, you know, but actually, as you say, it's quite a good account from different perspectives of the current state of Speedway, really, and particularly in Great Britain. And it seemed like there was a lot of affection to it. I mean, you say there, you know, you've been involved in interest in Speedway for some time now, but you seem quite affectionate at the way you approached it, and I felt like you were willing it along and willing British Speedway to be doing some good things and the clubs to be pulling through.
Yeah, I mean, I am absolutely, Mike. I mean, look, you know, Speedway's not perfect, and I think Speedway fans can be quite hard on their own sport at times, as well as loving it. I live in London. I frankly don't get to see Speedway nearly as much as I would like. But interestingly, both while I was writing the book and also since publication, a number of people who said to me, "Oh, Speedway, is that still going? I used to go to Ellesmere Port. Is it still going in Coventry?" And it's almost like, you know, I know lots of sports are fighting for airtime compared with, say, Premier League football or, you know, Six Nations rugby, but Speedway really has generally dropped off the mainstream. I mean, you had last year Great Britain winning the Speedway Nations, the first time, you know, we've been world champions since, what, 1989. Really get very much coverage. And I know Speedway fans up and down the country were saying, well, why isn't it getting more coverage? What I wanted to do, and I think I probably had limited success, I'm not quite sure I managed to succeed in getting it out to the wider audience that are really the full wider audience that I wanted to, just to sort of bang the drum for Speedway and say, listen, this sport is still going. There are good people involved in it. You should go and have a look.
Yeah.
And one of the people there is Lynne, I think.
Yes. That's what I was going to say. This sounds fantastic. I will admit I haven't yet read the book, but I will. But that's one thing that I thought has been missing from Speedway. Nobody seems to be emphasising the personalities in Speedway in this country like they do in Poland. Because in Poland, they concentrate a lot on, here's this rider, here's his family, here's where he lives, he does, this is what he likes. And we don't do that in this country to the same extent. So a lot of people, they might watch a rider week in, week out, but know nothing about him.
I think you're absolutely right, Lynne. And if you ever speak to Peter Oakes is sort of the venerable Speedway star columnist who I think has done just about everything in Speedway apart from win a world championship on a bike. He's done everything else. Lovely bloke. I spoke to him for the book as well. And he will say one of the things that he thinks Speedway is missing a trick on is those almost kind of behind the scenes, you know, Ty Woffenden, behind the scenes. We all know how Drive to Survive has worked for Formula One. I mean, my daughter is not interested in sport at all, but she watched Drive to Survive on Netflix. And now she watches Formula One. It's hooked people in. If someone could do that for Speedway, and you know, BT Sport did, I think it was, what was that documentary they did? True Grit 3 or 4 years ago, which is really nicely shot and put together, but it was a one-off. And I think, you know, somehow just bringing those personalities to life would be wonderful. Glasgow
did one. They did the In the Red documentary, which was due to have a film festival debut in 2020.
Of course.
Yeah, no, our cover in the Red actually gets quite a bit of coverage in the book, Lynne, because I think it's a terrific film. And having worked in TV news, kind of aware of the amount of filming, the amount of video that they must have had to get to that. I think is it about 80 minutes long?
Yes.
Yeah, to get that. And I think the film editor, was it Patrick? I think had been to every Glasgow meeting. So a real labour of love. And it is a terrific piece of filmmaking. Anyone who's not seen it, you know, even as a monarch, I would say go and watch it because it's terrific. It's
travelled as much as the riders did.
Yes, absolutely.
I think it's on YouTube, isn't it? I think it is available to watch on YouTube.
Yeah. It's a great shame it couldn't be picked up by someone like the BBC or one of the channels, because it's certainly good enough to be shown.
And that moves us on to Glasgow. I mean, you know, coincidentally with Lynne coming on, really, what struck me looking at some of the themes from the book was about the effort and the money that the clubs put into the promotion and the marketing. And actually I thought Glasgow came across really strongly, Roddy, from what you found, and in terms of the efforts to really reach out and put the resources in, knowing that you've got to go out there and try and pull people in. Is that something, Lynne? I mean, I don't know how much you can compare with other tracks, but is that something you're aware of with following Glasgow, that they really do put themselves out there?
Yeah, very much so. And the improvement in the facilities. If you want to just take the toilets for an example, before the Facenas took over, I wouldn't have gone there to die, to be quite honest, but they've really spruced up the facilities. They have snack bars all around the stadium, and you know, they've got the stand. They're building new stands all the time, and they have put a lot of money into it. And you know what they always say: if you want to make $1 million in Speedway, start with 3 million. So, but the centres have done a brilliant job getting it in, and they're just improving all the time and improving their management structure. And Scunthorpe was a favourite track that I used to go to, and down there is very much like the old Speedway tracks that I remembered. You know, going to Hampden, going to Coatbridge, going to Blantyre 1 and 2. The old time tracks where you're just in the open air, basically, watching these guys going round a track, and you come home and my hair's past my waist, and my mother loved brushing the shell out my hair. Not really, but yes, because you could get right up to the fence then, and you just ducked as the riders came round, and then of course the shell was all over your hair. So some tracks it's quite rudimentary. The racing's brilliant on the tracks. It's just sometimes the kind of ambience. Scunthorpe has a play park for kids beside the track, which is brilliant. Sheffield is much more corporate, and they've got the Rivalry, so you can actually sit and have your Rivalry behind the glass and watch all that, but it doesn't have the same ambience that Glasgow has. But because I think they were trying, they tried to make themselves more of a company entity rather than for the fans. There's good and bad in Sheffield. If you want to buy something at the track, it's tables at the side of the track, so you don't miss any racing. Glasgow did a brilliant job in making a track shop, but you've got to leave the stadium to go into the shop, which is not the best. Newcastle's quite well set up. Berwick suffers from sharing with the football club, and they also run on a Saturday night, and they often only have an hour or so to prepare the track. You know, so they do. There's swings and roundabouts, but Glasgow's certainly heading in the right direction. They've got a very, very professional setup, and they were treating it like a professional sport right from the beginning, which wasn't obvious in a lot of other places.
And it's great, I think, that that's been recognised, Lynn, because, I mean, last year Glasgow had, I think it was one of the qualifiers, and then it had the Great Britain against Poland International, which was a great initiative. And then this year they've got the Grand Prix qualifier, which I'm going to try and get up to. So I think it's great. Interesting you mentioned Scunthorpe there, because one of the things that, you know, when I do get to meetings, I think you've got, and you know what, I think it's a broad church, and I think there's room for both types. But for me, you've got Glasgow and you've got the Isle of Wight. I know the Isle of Wight's now slightly sort of not quite
not part of the gang.
Not quite part of the gang, but still running what I would call, what I think we'd all call Speedway. You go to Glasgow, you go to the Isle of Wight, and there seems to be much more sort of, you know, there's breaks to meet the Tiger, or there's kids races and things. You go to Scunthorpe, Rob Godfrey will, as long as he can, will run that meeting, bang, 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 and it's all about the racing. Yes. Now, personally, I'm probably more towards the let's go for the racing because I'm of that age. But clearly, I think we all know if Speedway is going to survive, you've got to get the younger generation in. So, you know, I think whatever works for whichever tracks, go for it. And I think, you know, we should be able to have, you know, maybe on the one side, you know, the Scunthorpes of this world, and on the other side, Isle of Wight and Glasgow.
But equally, Scunthorpe has a large youth following because they've got the practice track.
Yeah. So
you do get a lot of youngsters in through that.
I think you also raised another interesting point, which I think is, you know, picked up in the book. And I think, you know, people, I think a lot of Speedway supporters now will kind of point the finger at, you know, why aren't the promoters doing this? Why aren't the promoters doing that? You know what? Having spoken to quite a few of them for the book, you know, I think they have a really, really tough job at the moment. I think if you want to point the finger, in my view, maybe point it back 30, 40, 50 years, maybe back to the 70s. There are too many Speedway tracks that are not owned by the people who are promoting Speedway. I mean, I think Scunthorpe, Leicester, I'm not so sure about Redcar. I think Redcar, but like it's in a sense the tracks who can go and hold training days as and when. Whereas, as we know, there are the great majority of tracks in the UK are owned by, I don't know, Greyhounds Association or private enterprises. And if you get a good offer to build housing, or in the old days to build a supermarket, then I'm afraid Speedway gets moved. And as I said, I'm in London. We used to have, when I came down to London, I went to Hackney. Hackney's long gone, Wimbledon's long gone, Rye House is long gone, Arena Essex is long gone. I went down to Kent. I'll now have to go to, I'm not sure you pronounce it, Iwade. For the National Development League, or Oxford, which thankfully has now opened up. But the southeast of England, certainly around London, given there used to be so many tracks, it's just it's a huge shame.
And they did a big track at New Cross as well.
Indeed, and Haringey.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some good posters there in the background. You do cover a lot of the reasons why that might be, Roddy. This whole idea of the kind of vulnerability, really, of clubs and tracks, and the lack of being able to look more than a few years ahead and be able to see what the shape of the sport's going to be. I mean, you mentioned vision in the book, and you mentioned about the running of the sport, and there's a theme for me there that comes up about an independent running of Speedway in this country instead of the BSPA or BSP Limited now. And that came out for me quite strong, that actually that there's a danger that there's a self-interest there that could be stopping us from having a much clearer policy strategy direction for the sport in this country. Is that something that was a big thing for you?
It came over quite a lot from the fans that I talked to. And I think, it's a problem that always, or it's an issue that always comes up. Why is it the promoters themselves who are running the sport? Why isn't there, I don't know, a Bernie Eccleston or a, someone who can come in and be independent? Now, I don't want to turn this into a Scottish sport roundup, but having an independent body, and I'm looking at the main body that runs Scottish football, doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be a bed of roses. But for me, we all form our own opinions. I do think that having someone else doing the marketing for British Speedway would make a big difference. I think the individual promoters have a really tough job, keeping their own tracks going, marketing their own tracks to keep them in business. Because as we know, the days of, really big crowds at British Speedway tracks, apart from maybe the Cardiff Grand Prix, are sadly long gone at the moment. But I do think having someone independent on the marketing side would help. I think we've all seen the difference that having Rob Painter and Vicky Blackwell in charge of the Great Britain Speedway team, in terms of professionalising it both off the track and on the track, that has really made a difference. So for me personally, I would almost say the marketing would be best. But again, marketing costs money, and there isn't a lot of spare money around.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, I follow Formula E as well, the kind of the electric version of F1, if you like. And there's kind of a clear visionary who created it, really, Alejandro Agag, and he's handed it over now. But it's very, very on brand. Everything's very branded, and it's very consistent, the colours and everything. And we kind of got that a bit, didn't we, when the Grand Prix came along? I mean, some people watching or listening have maybe grown up with the Grand Prix and don't remember the World Championships and the World Finals and that whole big trail all the way through the qualifying rounds, and odd names for competitions that don't tell you who's in them, Commonwealth Final, Overseas Final, all sorts of things. But we kind of did see that, didn't we? And I mean, you could argue, couldn't you, that the branding on the Grand Prix side and BSI's involvement, that kind of led, didn't it, to Sky Sports getting more involved? Or would that have happened without the Grand Prix?
I think that's an interesting one, actually. I mean, I think one thing that I felt, we were talking just before we came on about snooker. I was sort of involved in television in the 90s, and the sense was that both snooker and darts had basically embraced live TV sport in a way that Speedway was late to doing. I mean, you know, I'm of the age, I can remember watching ITV World of Sport, Dave Lanning, commentary. It was all recorded on a Saturday afternoon. It did very well. And then at some point, probably sometime in the 80s, I think ITV decided it was live sport was where it was at. And I think Speedway was slow to jump on there. I think Sky was good for Speedway. Clearly, you know, they decided to give up the contract, was it 5-6 years ago now? I think it'll be interesting to see what Eurosport and Discovery Plus do. They're certainly talking a good game. As I understand it, the figures for the British League meetings that they showed in 2021 were up on the BT figures for the final year. Sorry, for 2019, the year before before COVID struck. So, you know, I think there are signs of promise in British Speedway. I think it's very easy to get downbeat about it. One thing I actually wanted just to throw over to Lynne, because one thing I mentioned in the book, which I think is really important, again, going back to snooker and darts, we've seen the amount of coverage which women making a big impact in boxing or horse racing or darts, how much publicity that attracts. Women haven't really had that breakthrough in Speedway, Lynne. I mean, I'm not sure. Do you? Would you want?
They haven't. There are some young women riders. There's a couple of motocross riders, female motocross riders, that if they make the jump to Speedway would do really well. And they're like about 14, 15 at the moment. So legally they have to be 16 before joining the proper Speedway ranks, but they could be in the juniors. And there are, I think, 3 girls in the junior British ranks at the moment. You know, so it's coming, but it's coming very, very slowly. But there was a ban on female riders for a while. They had female riders when Speedway first came over because they didn't make gender specifics. And then round about the late 60s, early 70s, they were going, no, it's not something a woman can do. Just like they banned women from football and they banned women from doing this. And then they said women could do it, but there wasn't a big queue waiting to do it. I mean, it's hard. It's more strenuous than you think. You have to be a lot fitter than you think. Some people say, oh, you're just sitting on a bike. Well, no, this bike is pulling you around the track and you have to control that. And it's heavy. So you have to be strong. You know, that could be part of it. But there's women road racers, but they don't get much publicity either. But it is the publicity, and I think it's coming down to nobody's been marketed as a personality. Because that's how a lot of footballers get known, a lot of snooker players get known. They get advertised as a personality. Hurricane Higgins was a brilliant one. It was his personality. You know, there's a lot of people probably couldn't remember a particular game he played, but they remember his personality. And that's, I think, where it's kind of gone, it's fallen down. But I do agree with you that we do need independent marketing. There might be a bit heading that direction. I don't know if you saw this morning the announcement that the championship is going to be streamed completely.
Yeah.
And that's by one company. And what we're still waiting to hear is, will individual clubs still do their own streaming as well? Because we're not sure if it's the kind of World of Sport format or whether it's like the football is now, the whole matches get recorded and they pick the highlights of the best ones to show.
Yeah. No, I saw that, Lynne, and it's interesting that I think one of the people behind it is Jitendra Duffel, who was the Red Car promoter and then sort of, I think, relinquished his role at the end of last year. He's in the book, lovely, lovely chap. So, you know, I wish him all the best with that because, you know, he sleeps, eats and breathes Speedway.
Yes.
I think it's a good idea because I don't know about you, but I've over the last couple of years paid to watch streaming matches. Glasgow's actually very good. Edinburgh's good on a different level as well. You know, Liam and the team there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned about, you know, females in the sport, women in the sport, and you you kind of hinted, I think, quite heavily in the book that, you know, Speedway in some ways hasn't moved with the times. And you mentioned Katie Gordon in there. That's one of the speed riders you did identify who's kind of hopefully got, you know, a future in the top 2 divisions. But you also did mention there about diversity. You know, you mentioned George Floyd and how that really brought that up in the wider conscience, and how there seems to be a real lack of diversity. And also, you know, the whole Twitter, Instagram generation who, you know, we're not seeing in the massive numbers at the tracks. Again, that could come down to marketing, couldn't it? But all with the streaming, and but the streaming at some points could be seen as a threat. I mean, you know, I think you've hinted as well that some people might be fearful that more people who can watch it somewhere else won't go to the track and spend their money there. I mean, it's a balance, isn't it, this one?
It is, but the streaming actually increased Glasgow's attendance. People bought the stream to see kind of what they were missing, and they said, actually, I want to go there. So it actually increased their gate numbers to a certain extent. And when they streamed the Great Britain-Poland match, that was just off the scale.
I was on for that one.
That was just off the scale. So it was really that was really good. But the marketing, nobody seems to be marketing these speedway riders as people. Now, okay, I'm biased, but the Glasgow team this year is full of very handsome young men. 4 of them. The other 3 aren't that bad. The other 3 aren't that bad either. But you know, I mean, Craig Cook and Ulrich, they're the kind of old men of the team, and you've got Brock Nicol, who's the handsome young American chap, and then you've got Daniel Hume, Benjamin Basso, Connor Bailey, and I've forgotten the other. Oh, Tom Brennan.
Yeah.
And they're good-looking young man. Market them like a boy band. Because when I was a teenager, but when I was a kid, I appreciated riders for being riders, for their skill. Because my father taught me, my grandfather taught me. When I was a teenager, I went, oh, he's a good-looking young rider, I'll watch him. And I actually got a group of girlfriends from my school, and we used to go down in the summer holidays. And at that time, Glasgow was promoted by Radio Clyde and Tiger Tim the DJ. So they got a big young female following. And as we progressed in our lives, we brought the various boyfriends, husbands in. It's a trick they're missing. You know, you've got a lot of these handsome, young, fit men. Why not market them like a boy band?
I think we've certainly missed a trick. I mean, I wouldn't have brought that one up, to be honest. And I'm not sure whether me and Roddy can go into a boy band, but
I certainly can't, Mike. Certainly, long gone.
But no, that's a really interesting point. And actually, and that's another thing, isn't it? There's a real dedicated fan base for Speedway. But I wonder, you know, it feels like you don't have to be a motorsport fan to be a Speedway fan. And I think that makes it quite different as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it does. I mean, I'll be honest, nothing against any of the sports, but you know, MotoGP or Formula One, I'm not really that interested in. I think it's the team element that first attracted me. You know, I was going along to watch my team, who happened to be based in Edinburgh, and you know, I'm not to the same extent as other people, but I have watched them in, you know, quite a lot of the tracks. So there is that almost kind of football sort of sporting the team rather than individuals. But it's how you can get the younger generation into that. I mean, you were sort of, I mean, in some ways, Speedway should be made for the digital Instagram generation, because you've got a minute of terrific action. You know, that's a good length of video. People will watch that. But for some reason, it doesn't quite, I don't know, whether it's the marketing, whether it's a lack of boy band figures or what, I don't know. I mean, it's there. I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a series of things. You know, I think Speedway will survive, but clearly we need the number of tracks we've got at the moment not to diminish any further.
You need a hook. Last year you had the Peterborough Panthers, Dad's Army.
Yep.
And towards the end of the season, that was bringing in lots of latent Speedway supporters, and everybody's rooting for the underdog. I mean, that's Britain.
Yeah. And that grand final against Bellevue, I mean, those two legs, I mean, what a week that was. I mean, even although last year had been a bit, a bit of a struggle to get through, Birmingham a bit in difficulty, Newcastle in difficulty, Eastbourne giving up. You had Britain winning the Speedway of Nations, and then I think was it just before those two terrific meetings, which anyone who didn't know what Speedway was about, I challenge them to watch those two and then come away and say, "Oh, it's the first one into the first corner who wins." It's not that at all. Absolutely not.
No, and I mean, again, parallels with snooker there. I mean, we run a Talking Balls podcast that goes out on Wednesdays, and it's a snooker one. And we have a thriving female scene. I'm just going back there for a moment and talking about personalities, picking up on the Higgins point. And actually, there's Rhiannon Evans, her name is. I mean, she made kind of national news a few months ago because she played in one of the tournaments on the World Tour, because now the top women players play on the male tour, which isn't the male tour now, it's the tour. And she came up against her ex, actually, and that made, I suppose, quite salacious in some ways. Yeah, do you remember that? Yeah. It made big news, a really awkward game to watch and probably horrible for them to play in. And she's won, I think, 12 world titles, but she's not really winning matches in the World Tour. And you kind of think it can't be because you're not a decent player. It's because you've not been in these arenas with these players and playing against that level of competition. It's not even the physical side. It's nothing like Speedway from that point. But if you get exposed to that competition, you'd imagine that over a few years, that standard will keep rising because you're playing against better people all the time. So again, it seems false, doesn't it, to kind of almost segregate and make it exclusive. It's a real opportunity.
Yeah.
In Speedway, you won't get an awful lot of husband-wife or partner rivalries, but you do have a lot of brothers. The Thompson twins are coming up. They're doing really well. You've got Zach and Ben Cook down at Poole. That's two wee Aussie boys. And you've got the Worrells, who've been going for a while. And from time to time, they come up against each other. And as time goes on, the Thompsons, that'll happen to them too. But you've also got the another two sets of brothers. There was the Lawson brothers and the Stead brothers. And in each case, only one carried on riding for the reasons I'm sure that you know what they are, because of misfortunes, and it highlights the dangers of the sport. But I honestly think that Speedway is the last truly dangerous sport we've got left. Formula One is great, it's a lot safer. And Speedway's a lot safer because of the air fence. But you've still got that element. Like what happened to Darcy Ward, brilliant young rider. Bang, split second. And he's in a wheelchair. So it's one of the last truly dangerous sports left. So where's all the adrenaline junkies?
Yeah, you do talk about that, Roddy, don't you? In terms of the air fence is coming in and it becoming a bit safer, but of course it's still never going to be safe enough to stop people from serious injury. Again, on the moving on the time with the times, you do mention there, Roddy, in the book about it's a dirty, noisy sport, polluting and all the rest of it. So there's an element of, you just said there, Lynn, about it's the last dangerous sport. It's also perhaps one of the surviving quite bad for the eco ones that aren't really going to tick all the green credentials. And there's so much talk now, isn't there, about electric vehicles and cleaning up the planet. I mean, is that something, Roddy, that came across at all in getting ready for this book?
I would say, Mike, in a very, very small way. A couple of people sort of mentioned it in terms of, possibly being an issue in the future for the sport. But I think it's, given everything else that Speedway was facing in 2020, it was probably sort of further down the road, as it were. I think there is an element of, in terms of Speedway being a sort of, a dirty, noisy sport, we know ourselves that that means you're not going to get perhaps the most salubrious venues. I mean, I think it says on the back of the book that Speedway very much now is almost kind of consigned to industrial estates on the likes of, Scunthorpe or Redcar or Armadale. People in houses don't necessarily want noisy motorbikes. I think there's also an element, and this is one thing that does slightly worry me for the future, is I think younger people who grow up and go to football, I mean, even if you go to, I don't know, an English, championship first division team, there is a certain standard of spectator amenity, and apart from maybe 2 or 3, maybe a handful, let's say, that's not really the case. I've taken members of my own family along to, I can remember taking them along to Arena Essex, and people kind of looking, thinking, gosh, really? Really? And you know what, I love Arena Essex because it meant I could go and watch Speedway. But unless you're a real fan, if you're coming for the first time, it's kind of like, oh goodness, is this it? And that, I think that's a bit of a hurdle, and it's a real catch-22, because I'm sure the promoters at Arena Essex would have loved to have had a stadium like Sheffield, for example, or Wolverhampton. But to do that, you probably got to be able to have a guarantee that you're going to be there for quite a few years, or have the site yourself, and that's not necessarily the case.
And in a way, some of the most thrilling and endearing parts of Speedway are the bits that can be putting people off at the start. So the noise, Yep. When I used to take my son, when I first took him years and years ago, I think it was probably at Peterborough, he'd have his ear defenders on because it was distressing. He was too young to enjoy that level of noise. And you love the smell of the burning methanol, and that all of that, you'd miss that terribly if any of that.
Absolutely. I don't know what Lynne would say, but I think the smell has gone a bit.
It has, because they've changed the formula.
Yeah, I think that's a miss. That was one of the things that attracted me. I mean, the noise, absolutely, Mike. It was the noise. It was the excitement. There is that hint of danger as well. And listen, I doff my cap to all the riders, because I wish in a way Speedway was a sport where they could charge more, to be able to pay the riders more, because they're not getting the same number of meetings these days. And I think I mentioned it in the book, the old Speedway conundrum. Riders don't have enough meetings, but they have to pay out a lot of money, and it's a sort of but the promoters aren't getting enough people through to pay more, and etc. It's a bit of a sort of a circular spiral, really. It smells great.
Yeah. Yeah. I was hooked on the first night at King's Lynn in 1990, and that was that. It was the smell and the whole look of it all, and the fact you could walk around the pits at the end, and as a 15-year-old, you could talk to those riders when they were loading the bikes up. Fantastic.
Absolutely. The approachability of Speedway riders is, it's like footballers back in the 30s. I wasn't around in the 30s, but as I understand it, it's the same sort of thing. Again, I can remember I think it was the Great Britain against Denmark at King's Lynn in October 2019. I think it was about the last meeting of the season, and I remember being on the first bend, and just behind me was Charles Wright, who'd come out to sort of have a look, and he was kind of a couple of feet behind me. You wouldn't get, I don't know, Cristiano Ronaldo, popping in to sit beside you, or get the bus. Just wouldn't.
Yeah, you wouldn't. In Glasgow, they've actually got it in their contracts that the Glasgow Tigers have to go into the Tigers Den at the end of every meeting, every home meeting, and meet the fans. So you find the stadium doesn't really empty as quick.
But that becomes so much of it, doesn't it? That becomes, because when you boil it down, it's 15 minutes of racing plus maybe some reruns and whatever else. But it's that whole thing around it, isn't it? There's the whole, and your friends. I mean, that came across really warm in the book, I thought there, Roddy. Just that thing about you get your favourite place on the first bend, or that group of people you always go with, and you remember that as much as you remember the meetings, don't you? That friendship and the new acquaintances you make.
Absolutely. And I think, that was really noticed for me, because I actually kicked the book off at Stoke, which unfortunately has gone. And indeed, the promoter I spoke to a couple of times, several times during the season, Dave Tatum, sadly died towards the end of last year. But, you could see that people at Stoke had their normal place, whether that was in the bar, whether that was in the restaurant, whether that was on the second bend. And it's a social thing as well. And, I think it's a huge shame when Speedway ends. I mean, Workington, again, covered in the book. I mean, they win 3 trophies, their first trophies. Oh, Lynn's.
Don't know. Steve Lawson's building a new one.
Indeed.
North side, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And the shale went down this week. So,
well, it would be great if it comes back, because I think,
yes.
am I right in saying the only track in the northwest of England now is Bellevue?
Yes.
Which is...
It's atrocious.
Yeah.
Glasgow rode Workington once.
Yep.
For half a season.
Yep.
Just
as Edinburgh rode at Glasgow, Lynn, didn't they? That didn't work out, did it?
And Coat Bridge. Edinburgh rode Coat Bridge as well.
Yeah. I spoke to Alex Harkis a couple of times for the book as well, and he told me how when Edinburgh rode at Glasgow, I think the fans threw bread rolls at each other.
Yes.
Which is,
it can get a bit tense.
There's a healthy rivalry. Listen, compared to some rivalries in Scottish sport, I think the Edinburgh-Glasgow Speedway rivalry is just the right side. Or it's fiery, but it's friendly.
It is, but I mean, and if you're in the stadium, and of course the Glasgow Edinburgh derbies are like any football derby, but we don't segregate the fans.
Yep.
Because my dad's got his favourite place that he likes to sit these days, and I get him sat down, and when there's Edinburgh there's always a group of Edinburgh fans that sit beside us.
Right.
And we just banter backwards and forwards, and it's all good natured.
Yeah. And
I think that was what struck my husband the first time he went, because he'd been used to football crowds. And I said, he's going, well, we're going to Sheffield and we're wearing Glasgow colours. Yes. How will we know what end to go in? You don't have to. And that really surprised him.
Yeah.
Because once people got to know that was his first live Speedway meeting, they were very encouraging. Would you like me to explain it to you? Will I show you how to fill out your programme? It was really, really good. And you get that at just about... I haven't not found it at a Speedway stadium.
Yeah.
In a way, it's that thing, isn't it? That the sport's bigger than the individual rivalry and that tribal element, which you do get in football, isn't it? Because I suppose everyone who goes to Speedway cares enough about Speedway, wants it to do well, and it's sad when the track closes, even if it's a rival you've kind of, wanted to beat for years and years. I'm sure Wolves would rather have Cradley back than not have Cradley there. So it's very different, isn't it? You mentioned Workington there, Roddy, and I remember something in there around, I think Laura Morgan mentioned it, and I've never thought about it like this, but you talked in there about, you were just saying the rider wages, how they pay for their points, but also from the promoter's point of view, and there was a quote in there where she was almost saying, willing her riders to stop putting 5-1s in at one point, because it was going to cost the club more to do it. And I thought, that's really interesting. I would never have thought about that from that angle.
Yeah, I think she qualified it quickly afterwards by saying it was a joke, but it's one of those things where I think we can all agree, what is it, happiness is 46, 44. You want to see a good night's racing, but you want to see your team win. But if you're a promoter, obviously, particularly if you're winning big away from home and you haven't got a home meeting for 2 or 3 weeks, that's when the pips squeak. And I think Workington in that particular season, what was it, 2018, went, I don't know, I'm going to get the dates wrong, but they went something like 6 or 7 weeks where they only had a couple of meetings and they had a lot of away ones, and they were winning big because they had a good team, and they ended up winning 3 trophies in a week. First kind of team trophies they'd won, and then didn't appear for the following season, which, was just, I thought, in a sense, encapsulated British Speedway as we go into the 3rd decade, unfortunately, fairly accurately. Because
if you win big at home, your home fans are going to hang about, they're going to buy more at the concession stands, they'll go buy more souvenirs at the shop, they'll hang around to talk to the riders, they'll buy themselves a drink to spend more time. But when they're winning away, that doesn't happen, because the away riders, they're packing up to go into the next race, and they're not normally hanging about that much, and winning away that often when they didn't have the home matches, I think is what tipped them over the edge, because they didn't have the revenue coming in to help support that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be improved, but what's really coming across, even just in this conversation, is again that fondness for the sport, that love for it, you know, and the stories about people you've met through it, and you know, and obviously family connections, and a lot of the riders seem to already come through with either family connections or, you know, people have looked up to and they've kind of got together with, and there is that big family thing which is so warm, and you don't find that in all sports for sure. In terms of positive then, so, you know, there's some things that we're concerned about, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the influence of Poland, because there's some good there, there's some problems there perhaps. We're in Britain, we can talk about how that feels from a British League perspective. But really, you ended the book there, Roddy, on that note really about the professionalism of Team GB and how that was changing, and there was a real identity around it and the structure. Which really paid off a lot quicker than perhaps any of us thought might do with the Speedway of Nations. Again, an interesting name for a tournament.
Yeah, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue, does it? I think it probably sounds better in French.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it is one of the positives. I mean, and then there's always a flip side, which is, of course, you know, Ty, Robert, Dan will not be racing in Britain next season. I think, am I right in saying that they're both, all three of them are going to be racing in Poland and Sweden now? I think I saw Ty's picked up a...
Ty's Denmark.
Esbjerg, yeah.
And, you know, I think, listen, Poland clearly is top dog, and it knows it's top dog, and it can kind of, you know, dictate to the authorities what goes on. And you can say, well, that's terrible. You know, maybe it was what Britain was doing back in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. And maybe it's, you know, maybe we should just get on with it. I don't know. I sort of fluctuate in how I think Britain should sort of react to it. I mean, again, you know, the 2020 season, which wasn't one of the best races that I saw in real life, was at the British Youth Championships at Scunthorpe, the first kind of organised meeting that started off after the first lockdown in August. And the best race of the day, and there were a lot of races, was at the 250 level, and it was Max James and Luke Harrison, you know, two very promising youngsters. So, you know what, we all know you can get really good races without the big names. We also know you can get pretty dull races with the big names. There's this whole thing about, you know, some clubs are annoyed because they don't get their proper race night. I mean, I think that was one of the reasons why Poole dropped into the championship, because they, you know, they preferred to sort of race on their chosen race night rather than one of the designated ones. I do think it would be great if most British tracks could race at the weekends, but again, then you're getting into problems of, well, are there enough riders to cope, to go round? Because as we know, we've not talked about doubling up, but you know, you're either for it on the behalf of the riders, or you're against it on behalf of lots of fans who like to associate with riders for one club. Or you sort of say, well, look, we're not going to bother with the big riders and just get on with it ourselves. I don't know what the answer is.
Poland's got the pool with money. I mean, just for example, you've got young kids, 19, 20, you've got Tom Brennan, and he's 20 now, and he's just won the Speedway of Nations, and he is going to, I think he's going to be riding for one of the lower league clubs in Poland. But if he was riding for Wrocław like Dan Bewley is, they fund them. They provide them with a bike. There's 10 grand, just like that. You know, and they pay them more.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, and somebody that's not riding in Poland has got to fund it all themselves. And it's not easy, and they need at least two. Because sure as eggs, one will break down or crash.
No, it's a different financial world out there. And I think, you know, in terms of the clubs, one thing I did discover was, you know, the amount of support that they will get, not just from local businesses in a scale that, you know, I don't think many clubs get here. And listen, there are some very good sponsors involved at British Speedway at club and international level, but also local council help. I think councils see the Lublins, the Rosslers of this world as being good to get their name out on a more international stage. And bless their socks, I'm not sure many councils in Britain have a lot of money to spend on the local speedway track.
They don't.
No, but there is a flip side to that. I mean, again, I'm trying to remember from the book there, Roddy. I think it was Nikolai Klint that you highlighted in terms of the Polish league, and there was something around. Didn't he opt to race in one of the lower divisions because he was more likely to get consistent racing rather than be chopped?
Yeah, I think one of the for the top league, and Lynne will know this as well. They operate on a squad system, and if you're not racing, I mean, there's no guarantee you're going to get a race at the end of the week. So I think racing for his team, he was guaranteed. I think he will actually be in the Extraliga this year. Although again, I think I'm right in saying I think Nikolai Klint it hasn't got a team in Britain this year at the moment.
Not so far. There's still a few spots open. Yep.
Very true. Very true.
But Bellevue's not full.
Indeed. I hadn't actually booked anything up, thankfully, but I was intending to go across to Poland and actually do a week. That was going to be my summer holiday with my wife for 10 days to go around 3 or 4 of the tracks. But obviously that got kiboshed by coronavirus. But I'd still like to go out because people tell me it's a completely different world. Almost, we were talking earlier about, how fans kind of are on the same part of the terraces in Britain. I think certainly in Poland, there's a pen section for the away fans. It's much more tribal. It's much more football oriented.
It is, but and of course the dedication that we saw in 2020, where because they had restricted numbers in the stadium, they got on the cranes.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can do that at Glasgow as well. We've got a yard behind us that they have these high-rise cranes.
Right.
Nobody actually did it, but they could have done.
How do you feel it's bounced back, or has it bounced back? How do you feel it's recovered post-COVID then? I mean, obviously from two perspectives, really. Yours from the point of the book, Roddy. I don't know whether you've spoken to anybody that you spoke to for the book in the last few months to reflect on the year that wasn't and then the year that was.
I haven't actually, Mike. What I would say, without sitting on the fence, I think it's been mixed. I mean, I think internationally it's been good. I think the season ended really, really positively. I think I always thought last year was going to be a year to basically endure and get through and almost kind of regroup. So we knew we'd lost Somerset and Swindon at the start of the year. We sadly lost Eastbourne. We almost lost Newcastle and Birmingham, although fingers crossed they seem set for next season. We sort of lost Kent at Sittingbourne, but now they're at least still continuing at the National Development League level. And I think the big thing, and again, it was one of those things where I wanted to pick on some of the campaigners, to follow some of the campaigners, and for better or worse, I thought Oxford possibly had more chance of coming through than Coventry, although I'm sure we'd all love to see Coventry make a comeback, because what's happened there is terrible. And in a sense, in the end, I'm sure if there were any Oxford campaigners who were listening to this, they'll say it was not it was not a short decision process, but certainly from sort of where I left it, it did suddenly seem to go through quicker than I was expecting. And I think it's terrific, that they'll be lining up in the spring, Scott Nichols on the track, Jason Crump as team manager. I think it's mixed. I think a lot depends, to be honest, on this whole kind of Eurosport discovery. I think a lot depends on, can we get through this season without losing any more tracks? I think, I don't know about you, but I think 6 tracks for the Premiership, it wouldn't, 8 would be better. I mean, I don't know. There's always talk, Lynne, about Glasgow moving up.
Yes, but I think Glasgow's quite happy at the moment because most of the championship sides are in the north of England.
Yeah.
So it's just the logistics of getting to them. Now, years ago, they used to have a north-south split. It wasn't like a higher league and a lower league. It was just, there was the North League and there was the South League. And that was, but then transport wasn't as easy. Travelling wasn't as easy. There weren't the motorways, you know, and that was to help that. But I don't know if that would work, because very few riders actually live anywhere near a track that is their home track. Very, very few.
It comes out ever so often, doesn't it? Well, quite regularly, actually, the whole argument again for one big league, which we've had before. I kind of remember that. But that whole one big league idea, and because it is a bit strange, isn't it, to have the top division where almost all the teams in it are in the playoffs. There's just a couple that miss out. But the doubling up argument as well. I mean, you know, I have to admit, I've come back in quite recently and really kind of got quite passionate and almost obsessive to try and catch up with what I've missed, because I haven't seen any racing for a little while. I used to go a lot in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I looked at the teams and thought, blimey, you know, there's no GP riders, or there's one or two GP riders at that point. The averages, you know, some of the guys' averages and the heat leaders, and I was just looking, thinking, wow, the standard just seems to be so much lower. But that's the standard of rider in the idea of who's the best, as opposed to, but what's the quality of racing? And you've said already that actually the quality of racing can be good, whoever it is. It doesn't depend on the quality of the rider. But the box office part of it, you know, Ty Woofenden, the book, Peter Oakes involved in that as well. And you kind of think, you know, he was for a long time the most saleable speedway rider on the planet, I would have thought. And we've seen him on national TV, I'm sure. But we're not going to see him in Britain again in the league, are we, for a while, if at all, unless something fundamentally changes.
How old's his oldest daughter? When does she start school? That's going to have a big bearing.
Yep.
I think she's 4 now. Something like that.
I think he put something on social media today to say if he could have all his home meetings, just ride the home meetings, he'd want to ride in Manchester, he'd want to ride at Bellevue and just ride from there. As if to say, if I could do that and just do home matches, I'd return to England. I'm not sure if that was tongue in cheek or not, but he put something along those lines today on social media.
That's right. It was something that was discussed, I believe, for this season, and an agreement could not be reached.
He has in the past been quite critical of track preparation in Britain. And I think it was in the fact in Peter Oakes, the Peter Oakes autobiography. And so, you know, I think that may well have to change. I think that's crucial. I mean, you know, again, Lynne may know more than me on this, but there seems to be a problem getting the right kind of shale in the right kind of quantities over the last few years. I mean, you know yourself, I mean, I've been to a few meetings over the years which have been quite processional. And it's, you know, you do need a good track to be able to get the racing that will attract people who are coming along for the first time. Because you know, if you do go along and it is processional and people kind of go, well, I'm not quite sure what that was all about. So the quality of the track is really important. But again, you know, it's just one of those things. Had you heard about the quality of shale?
Yes, some tracks were experimenting with different things, and it wasn't all shale.
Right.
They were experimenting with different surfaces. I just think shale's good. It's the smell of the shale and the feel of the shale, and you know, sometimes you get a face full of grit and you're going, that's not shale, you know, different stuff. So it's there is a big aspect of that, and I know Ty's been very disparaging about it. But equally, Ty couldn't have broken into Europe without coming via the UK route, coming from Australia. Because in Australia, they're all solo riders riding individual events. They don't ride for teams. And he needed to learn to team ride, or to ride as part of a team. And Britain is as good a training ground as any for that. And it helps you cope with difficult tracks, because yes, Poland's got lovely tracks, but you've got Czechoslovakia and I'm showing my age, the Czech Republic, and you've got Denmark and Sweden, and they're smaller, more technical tracks. And if you ride in the UK, you get a bit of everything. You know, so you get to work out what kind of track suits your kind of riding. And from then on, you can decide where you want to go. But once you've ridden a lot of the tracks on mainland and continental Europe, I think you would start to think, actually, it's not so good coming back to Britain. Not all of the tracks are the same, but there are a few tracks where they go, no.
Perhaps there's the thing as well, linking back to the one about, you know, owning your own track and owning your stadium and being able to spend time on it. I mean, I guess in some cases you might not get a lot of time to prepare your track in terms of when you're able to access the site and the time between that and the start going, the tapes up and all the rest of it. So it might not even be in some people's real gift to change that, and that's one of the things that hamper them. But he got a good grounding though, didn't he? I mean, I remember I was at the meeting at the what was it called, the Ladbroke Olympic, I think it was, the one that Wolves, the individual at the end of the season. Yeah. And I was at the one where Ty was announced, and there's this little fella, and we've probably heard of his dad more at that point, Rob, and you kind of see this lad coming along, and he's, you know, at that point, he'd be a few stone wet through, and you thought, oh, well, interesting fella, you know, I wonder where this lad will go. And he'd been doing all right, I think, in the lower leagues at that point, and you'd never predicted. Well, I say you would never have predicted, but now there's people talking about other riders in the same breath, and I think Jordan Palin, he's certainly come across a few times now, and some very big accolades for him, isn't there? Is he somebody you've picked out, Roddy?
Yeah, I mean, Rob Godfrey, the Scunthorpe promoter and sort of top man at the BSPL, was very, very impressed with Jordan Palin. And I think, you know, again, if we're looking for plus points, I think there are some really good, you know, Lynne's mentioned Tom Brennan, you know, Drew Kemp, you know, the 15 or so who were at the British Academy, I think at Bicester last week. There are some really promising riders coming through now. You know, whether the Rising Star program, which I know has been slightly scaled back this year, I think it's just one of the leagues this year. I think, you know, we need riders in Britain. Hopefully those good young riders will get a good grounding in Britain. It's interesting. I think they're more likely at the moment to go over, again, Lynne mentioned, I think Tom Brennan riding in Poland. That probably wouldn't have happened 10, 15, 20 years ago for that similar age of rider. So they're not afraid to go out to Poland and get the experience while also, you know, learning their trade in Britain. But I think we do seem to have a decent crop of young riders, and I think Jordan Palin, yeah, absolutely is a name that comes out a lot. Very young as well. I think he's just 16, possibly now just 17. I'm not sure. 17.
Yeah. And Ty wasn't a wonder kid when he first came over.
No, was he at Scunthorpe when he started out? I'm trying to think.
He was at Scunthorpe, and he started out at the same time as Josh Ottey.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Josh Ottey stayed with Scunthorpe, and Ty moved on.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue, isn't it? Because I think Josh Ottey's testimonial was coming up early in the season, and that was put off a few times, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. No, Josh. Sorry, Mike.
No, I was just saying. Hopefully, this time it'll go ahead and he'll have his day.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know Josh was one of the riders who I spoke to again during the course of the season, always very happy to speak on the phone. And it was, you know, he absolutely missed his Speedway. And I think Peter Oakes has done an interview with him in Speedway Star. And, you know, I think he's looking forward to, in a sense, a new reboot at Birmingham this year, because he was with Scunthorpe for quite a while. But it's nice that his testimonial is taking place at Scunthorpe. So hopefully people will come out.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get down for that one.
Yeah, that'd be a good one. Yeah. So before we move to the kind of the segment at the end there, where we do a little bit of quick fire, I just wondered, just a few last reflections, Roddy, if you would, just in terms of, you know, I wanted to hear from you because of the book that you wrote, but it's really interesting finding out more about, you know, how it was put together. I mean, how long did it take you to write it? And, you know, would you do another book on Speedway?
I'm not sure if I'd do another book on Speedway. In terms of writing it, I sort of tried to pick 3 or 4 themes, 3 or 4 either meetings or characters or personalities for each of the months, and either try. So, for example, I think, December 2019, obviously December is quite a quiet month for Speedway, but I thought that was quite a nice one to sort of introduce Laura Morgan, who I did speak to, and Workington, and I just kept it going throughout the season. Clearly, it changed hugely in March. I was at the Ben Fund meeting, which was at one point the only meeting that took place. And I can remember Rob Godfrey in the centre green and saying, please watch this space. It looks like we're facing the plague. And I thought, gosh, that sounds a bit extreme. But lo and behold, here we were. So hats off to the publishers. Pitch Publishing, because I did wonder, because it wasn't necessarily the book I pitched to them, but I think they thought because of the COVID and how it was affecting, and how were people reacting to it. One thing I would quite like to mention, just mentioning the Ben Fund, is that my royalties from the book are all going to the Ben Fund. So I think they get their first lot probably in March from sales of the book, because I think, a bit like Lynne talking there, I mean, I've got the utmost respect for the riders who do it, and it is a dangerous sport. They do get injured. So I thought the least I could do was make my royalties available to the Ben Fund. So that's what I decided to do. And Paul Ackroyd, who's the sort of the head man at the Ben Fund, again was really good to chat to, and very helpful throughout the writing of the book.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all credit. Sorry, Lynne. All credit to you. Yeah, I was gonna point that out, that it's on the book as well, that your profits are going to the benevolent fund. Sorry, Lynne, go on in there.
I was just going to ask, as I haven't read it, and until your post came up, I hadn't heard of it. Where can people go and get this book?
I think the expression is it's available from all good online booksellers, Lynne. In fact, I think it's actually on a discount at Amazon. Not that I would necessarily point you there, but Waterstones and is it Goodreads or whatever? Yeah. You can buy it from there as well.
Excellent.
It's an excellent book. I mean, I would recommend it to anybody who likes. To be honest, I say anyone who likes Speedway, but anyone who's even heard of it, wants to know more. I would say you don't have to be a Speedway fan to get quite a good insight into the sport by reading this. But yeah, there's a lot in there if you do follow Speedway, and a lot of personal stories, which at the end of the day is a lot of what we've talked about tonight. We've talked a bit about racing. We've also talked a lot about people. Let's go to the quickfire then. So what I want to do really is just to find out more about you guys in terms of some of your history with Speedway, your favourites, the things you like. We've touched on some of them, but I'm just going to do it. I'm calling it, this is a bit twee. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to call it 5 ride maximum. So I'm going to ask 5 questions. They've all got short answers. And I'll ask you both, because you've both been kind enough to give me your time so that we can put this together. So number 1 then. So the first race, here we go. Let's just try and get 15 max. So your first ever meeting, can you point us to or tell us anything about the first meeting you went to? And we'll start with Lynne. Go on, Lynne. Can you remember?
My first ever meeting would be at Hampden, and I went with my dad and my grandfather and spent most of the time in the pits, because my grandfather was really nosy, and my dad and grandfather rode motorbikes themselves, but not Speedway bikes. But they were very into the technical stuff, so that was my introduction to Speedway. I don't think I even saw one of the races that first time, because I got hooked on the bikes themselves.
Great, thank you, Lynne. And Roddy, can you help us with
that? My first one was, I think, March '82. I went to see Edinburgh Monarchs, and I think it was against a select. I'm not quite sure who, but I can remember the Edinburgh team. It was a year after Edinburgh won the KO Cup with Neil Collins, who I think had just moved on. But, there was Dave Trounson, there was Brett Saunders, there was Ivan Blacker, Roger Lambert. I can kind of, go through the team. And I went there with a couple of friends, and I was hooked.
Yeah. Well, I could actually tell you about a match that I remember actually watching the racing. And it was Wembley in London.
Wow. And
it was Ollie Olsen had 2 broken wrists, and he wasn't allowed to ride with his plasters on. So he broke the plasters off at trackside and road and won.
Wow.
Okay, now that dates me. That's 60s. That dates me. It was a long time ago. And I think it might have been 71, 72, something like that. But it was,
wow.
yes, that was a world final at Wembley.
I mean, that I'm jealous. The notion of going to watch a world final at Wembley, wow, that would have been fantastic. Sadly, not going to happen for a lot of us. And my first one, I'm going to answer as well, just because it's the first time that we've done this, and I'm not going to do it again. So for myself, I'm not going to do it again. But for me, it was Kings Lynn. It was 1990. Kings Lynn is British League. Kings Lynn against Oxford. You mentioned Oxford earlier. And in the Oxford team, I mean, I was spoiled. Your first ever meeting, you go to a really good racetrack, and that was a great racetrack. Hans Nielsen in the opposition team. I think Nielsen was the world champion at the time. I think Martin Dugard was there. Dean Barker. I think Troy Butler. I think Simon Wigg was there. I was racking my brains earlier to think was Wiggy there at the time, but I think he was. And it was a 45-all draw, so everyone went home happy. It was fantastic. Question number 2, so you've all got through the first ride. There you go, 3 points each. Your favorite track or venue, and obviously it could be the track that you love, it could be the venue you love, or there's just something that is close to home on that one. What's your favorite track or venue? We'll go for Roddy first on this one.
The obvious one would be Powder Hall because it was the first one, but I think I'll go for something else. You know what? Only because it's gone, and I was really pleased I managed to get along. I managed to go to White City. It's probably not the greatest track, and it's now long gone. I think the BBC built on it, and it's now other TV studios. But I had a soft spot for White City, and I managed to get to, I think it was at the Intercontinental Final in 82 or 83 there. And I just have a very, very fond memory of it because it was the first really big meeting I'd been to. There was a good crowd, and it just sticks in my memory.
Sounds great. Very good. Very interesting. Lynn, hopefully that's given you time to think of or it might be an easy one for you. What's your favourite venue?
Well, the easiest, my favourite venue that I've been to is actually Scunthorpe. It's because although it doesn't have all the facilities, it does have the best chips. And the people were really nice, and you could wander anywhere and get to talk to anyone, and I just like the atmosphere there. That was it. But one I've never been to that I want to go to is Torun in Poland. I just think it looks spectacular, and I hope it would live up to it.
Maybe Roddy could take you if you decide to go again to Poland for the trip. Then we could sort that one out, couldn't we?
That's it.
Sorry, yeah, great shout. And Scunthorpe, yeah, again, features quite heavily in the book actually. Number 3, then we'll go for Lynn first on this one. So you've got your 6 points out of 6. Who's your favourite rider? This could be past or present. It's really up to you, and for any reason that you want to say them.
Right, my favourite rider growing up, my first hero was Charlie Monk, and I thought he was a brilliant rider. And as a rider, I really admired Peter Collins because he tended to come from the back. And I really admire riders that do come from the back. And at Glasgow, Craig Cook's famous for doing that at the moment. But Peter Collins, you always wanted him to have an infringement in that final heat so that he started 15 yards back, because you just knew he was going to weave his way through the traffic and make it.
Lovely. It's a good answer. Thank you for that, Lynn. Roddy, what do you think? Who's your fave?
Can I be greedy and go for one from earlier on and one from just now? My one from before, it isn't an Edinburgh Monarchs rider. Actually, it's Joe Owen, who rode for the Newcastle Diamonds, because I worked in Newcastle for a while. And it was at the time where the Diamonds, I think, were hoovering up was it the National League then, Lynn?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was just a really exciting rider. I can remember actually covering his benefit meeting, because obviously he had a bad accident at Brough Park in probably the mid to late 80s. So Joe Owen from before. No, just because it was such a big part of writing the book. I remember watching Robert Lambert winning the European Championship in 2020 on my wee mobile in a hotel, because I was up in Northumberland and I was in the bar, and you know, we were still all covered in masks and whatever else, and he won it. And I can remember like that, and people were kind of looking around going, what is the, you know, is there any football on, whatever? No. So, you know, I have a real affinity for Robert Lambert for that performance in Europe. And I think it's also it's symptomatic of British Speedway that, you know, he got really no coverage outside Speedway press, which I think is a huge shame. I know the European Championship's a slightly odd animal, as it were, but even so, you're European champion.
Yeah, you should celebrate British success whichever way, shouldn't you? Hopefully, but yeah, it's a sign of where we are, sadly, isn't it? Although looking back, I can't remember what the coverage was. I remember quite a bit of coverage for Gary Havelock winning the world title. I'm trying to think about Mark Loren when he won it, but certainly Javi, I remember a lot of press.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a lot with him when Peter Collins won. He won when he'd broken his ankle or his foot. He poured the blood out his boot anyway after he'd won it. A bit like Jason Doyle the other year.
Yeah, these guys are made of something else, aren't they? Right, excuse me, sorry. So we're 9 points. We've got 2 more rides each. So number 4. Now, this might not be the same rider as your favourite, but who would you say is the most entertaining rider that you've seen? And we'll go Roddy on this one.
Goodness. You know what? I'm going to go for Danny Ayres. It's the name that comes to mind. And again, you know, a real shame that Danny Ayres isn't with us anymore. I think really epitomised someone who I think got into Speedway later on, was a real trier, was an old-fashioned Speedway rider. You know, I think I mentioned it in the book that, you know, the race that stands out for an awful lot of people was his race in the British final, where he was leading Chris Harris, and then just at the very last minute, but he was on the, you know, he was all set fair for the 2020 season as was, and it's just such a shame he's not with us. So for me, Danny Ayres, I think I saw him a couple of times, and for me, he was an entertainer. Great loss.
Yeah, absolutely, and as well as you say, Dave Tatum as well. As 2 people there that was mentioned tonight. Yeah, so you know, or thoughts with families. It's just horrible, really, isn't it? Okay, Lynn, what about you then? Who were most entertaining riders? So again, it might not be your favourite, but who's the most entertaining?
Bomber Harris when he's on his game, because he can just come from anywhere and you're not expecting him at all. I know a lot of people go, oh, Smarslick, he's entertaining, but Smarslick in his early days was dangerous, so people would just get out of his way to avoid a crash. He's better now, I'll give him that, and he is still quite entertaining. But Bomber Harris for me is definitely still worth it.
I would agree with Lynn in terms of, I think Bomber Harris was one of the riders of the season last year.
Yeah,
really good. And I have to say, every time, and I watch it every so often on YouTube, that ride at the Cardiff Grand Prix, the back of my neck. I mean, I've got, you know, he's never ridden in any team I've supported, but that ride, the hairs on my back of my neck stand up. It's just, it's class.
Yeah, it really is.
Which brings us nicely onto the last question, which you'll get the 5 ride maximum if we get that one, which is about the best meeting watched, really, which could be for any reason or just one that sticks in your mind. But you know, is there any particular meeting you just think that will always stay with me? How are you on that one, Lynn?
Yeah, it's fine. That last year at Glasgow, towards the end of the season, we had a young Polish rider, Marcin Nowak, and his very first meeting, and he was a reserve paired up with Connor Bailey, and the pair of them came out in his very first meeting, and he was still struggling a wee bit, getting the hang of the track, and on the 4th bend on the last lap, when everyone sweeps out, he swept in and then up between the two opposing riders. And I sit near the start line, and I honestly thought he was coming over the fence, and went in to get the 5-1 with the corner. And it was just absolutely astounding to see that, particularly to see it at Glasgow, because we don't see that kind of guts very often.
Yeah, which, as I can see why that would stay with you. That's going to stick in the memory a long time, isn't it? It's exceptional. Thanks for that, Lynn. Roddy, what about yourself?
I may be flunking the 15 next one here, because I can't remember who they were against. But the one, when you said that, the one that sticks in my mind was a meeting at Exeter's county ground back in the 80s, and I can remember. I hadn't been to that many away tracks, and obviously sort of, I think, Powder Hall, White City, Hackney, Wimbledon. And I have to say, even as a spectator, I was scared looking at the track at Exeter and the speeds and the banking. And that, was it that fence?
Yeah.
Solid fence?
It's just a wooden fence, the solid fence, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I'm probably going to cede to Lynn on the 15 points here, because I can't remember who they were racing. But it's what just sticks in the memory as being just, you know, go back to what Lynn was saying about the element of fear. You know, I was standing on the terraces and I thought, wow, I would not want to be on there. I know a lot of riders have not enjoyed, didn't enjoy racing at Exeter. But you know, sadly, another track that's long gone. And you know, we're talking about London not having many tracks, or any tracks. I think the southwest as well. I mean, it's really Plymouth now, because Exeter's gone, Somerset's gone, Bristol's long gone. It's a shame.
Yeah. Well, look, Roddy, if you can't have 3 points for that, then maybe what we could do is give you 2 in a bonus and get paid for 3.
Okay, well, that's very kind of you.
For 3.
But rider of the night is Lynn.
Rider of the night, that's it. Yeah, 14 and 1 against the 15. There you go.
Fair enough.
There we go.
Fair enough.
But look, I mean, all it leaves me to say really is thanks very much for the time. You know, this is the first time we're doing it in Speedway, and really just the book was fantastic. I'm going to show it again, especially because the profits are going to the benevolent fund. But it's a really engrossing book. I read it in only a few sittings. I don't normally do that. It's a great piece for where we are now, and it's kind of sets up where we're going next, because it just is a moment in time. It'd be lovely to read that in years to come and think, blimey, that's where the sport was in Britain. Now look how good it's going. I mean, that would be a good thing to see that as a historical document that we can go back and go, yeah, we remember when that was there, but look what happened. So let's keep our fingers crossed. But thanks very much. Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Roddy. And you know, I'll keep an eye out for the Tigers now, won't we? And the Monarchs.
Yes.
Absolutely. And thank you, Mike. Very much enjoyed it.
Yes.
Nice to meet you, Lynn.
So did I. Yeah.